The last sensation I could recall was a corrosive, bitter chalkiness coating my tongue. A final, desperate act to silence a pain that had nothing to do with the physical blows my husband had delivered and everything to do with a lifetime of being unloved. The nothing. A void. I opened my eyes to the faint, familiar pattern of water stains on my bedroom ceiling. The air smelled of lemon polish and the faint, cloying sweetness of my sister's perfume. For a heart-lurching moment, I was disoriented, convinced the bleak decades of my first life had been a horrific, prolonged nightmare. But the memories were too visceral, the emotional scars too raw. The taste of rat poison was a ghost on my lips. This was real. I was back. I was Alara Croft, 17 years old, and it was the spring of 1969. The government's shadow loomed over families like mine. Intellectuals, former professionals, people with unreliable backgrounds. The whispers of re-education and relocation to collective farms were growing from a murmur to a roar. I heard them then, the hushed, urgent voices from the living room. Sliding out of my narrow bed, I padded to my door and pressed my ear against the cool wood. "We have to be practical, Alistair." My father's voice, usually so full of academic certainty, was frayed with fear. "The notice could arrive any day. Alara is strong. She's resilient. She can handle the farm labor. But Lyra, her constitution is too delicate. The doctors have always said so. She wouldn't survive a month of that life." Soft sob. My mother Isolde. "I know, my love. I know. We must get her to safety. Captain Caelan Vance is from a strong military family. His father is a respected commander. If we arrange the marriage quickly, she can go with him to his base. She'll be protected. She'll be safe." My blood, which had been frozen in my veins, turned to ice. This conversation. I remembered it. This was the catalyst, the moment my first life was set on its irrevocable path to misery. They had married my older sister Lyra to Caelan Vance. They believed his family's status was an impenetrable shield. They were catastrophically wrong. The Vance family, too, fell from grace, accused of some nebulous political disloyalty. They were exiled to a far harsher, more remote labor camp than the one my family was sent to. And Lyra, with her porcelain doll fragility, died giving birth to a child who would never draw breath on that frozen, unforgiving earth. Her death became my original sin. My parents never forgave me for surviving when their favored daughter did not. Before I could step out and scream the truth, the door to Lyra's room across the hall flew open. She rushed out, her face pale but etched with a sharp, calculating determination that seemed utterly foreign on her usually placid features. She looked older. Her eyes held a knowledge that chilled me to my core. She remembered. She had also returned. "Mother, father," she declared, her voice a tremulous blend of false sweetness and barely concealed panic. "I've decided. I will go to the countryside with you. Let Alara marry Caelan." The room fell into a stunned silence. My parents stared at her as if she'd spoken in tongues. "Lyra, darling, no," Isolde said, rushing to her side and clutching her hands. "You don't understand the hardship. It's backbreaking work, filth, hunger." "I do understand," Lyra insisted, a hysterical edge sharpening her tone. "It wasn't selflessness, it was pure, unadulterated terror. I want to be with you. Alara is the strong one. Let her have the easy life in the city with the Vances." I watched them, a cold, sick understanding settling in my gut. He knew. She knew the fate that awaited the Vance family. She wasn't sacrificing herself for me. She was executing a ruthless strategy to save herself, pushing me into the pyre in her place. My father's face softened with pathetic, grateful relief. "Oh, Lyra. Your selflessness. Told she's right. Lyra's robust. She will be fine on the farm. And Lyra will have us to care for her. It's a perfect solution." The narrative was rewritten in an instant. Lyra, the selfless saint, magnanimously giving up her golden future for her weaker sister. I was now the beneficiary of her immense, unwanted charity. "Alara," my father said, finally turning to me as if I were a junior business associate, not his daughter. "Your sister is making a great sacrifice for you. You will stay in the city and live a comfortable life. In return, we feel it is only fair that the family's savings and valuables remain with Lyra, as compensation for her loss." A bitter, incredulous laugh escaped my lips before I could stop it. "If life with the Vances is so comfortable, then Lyra should keep it. I'm used to hardship. I'll go with you to the farm. No. Lyra's shriek was raw and piercing, devoid of any pretense. She looked at me, and in that charged moment, our shared, impossible secret hung naked in the air between us. She knew that I knew. The game was revealed. It's decided, Alistair said, his voice turning to ice as he glared at me, any hint of gratitude vanishing. You get the marriage and a chance at safety. Lyra gets our support. We'll give you $500 for a dowry. That is more than generous. $500. I lowered my head, the number echoing in the hollow space they had carved out inside me over a lifetime. My father, a once wealthy history professor, and my mother, an heiress to a modest textile fortune, were leaving everything. The hidden savings, my grandmother's jewelry, the antique scrolls, to Lyra. My worth was quantified, and it was meager. A pittance to ease their collective conscience. Tears welled in my eyes, hot and shameful. They were the last tears I would ever shed for them. I didn't argue. I simply nodded, my heart hardening into a shield of cold, impenetrable iron. Let them have their illusions. Later that day, my mother, perhaps prickled by a ghost of conscience, slipped into my room. She pressed 2 thick envelopes into my hand. There's $2,000 here and some ration coupons for grain and cloth, she whispered, her eyes darting towards the door. Don't be angry with us, Elara. You are the lucky one. This is all thanks to Lyra's sacrifice. Leaving her the assets is our way of helping you atone. Atonement. The word was a knife twist. For being born healthier? For not being her favorite? For surviving? I took the money without a word. Atonement was not what I needed. I needed a weapon. And this money, this pittance they offered to quiet their own guilt, would be my first. The next day, I walked alone to the Vance family's apartment in the military compound. I carried a small, shabby cloth bag containing my few belongings. My parents were too busy with Lyra, orchestrating her doomed salvation, to spare a thought for my wedding day. The streets were bustling, a world oblivious to the silent drama unfolding within me. Mrs. Vance, Rhea, answered the door. She was a handsome woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and a practical, no-nonsense air. She took in my solitary, shabby appearance with surprise, which quickly melted into a dawning, uncomfortable pity. You must be Elara, she said, her voice warm but cautious. We've heard so much about you from your parents. But where are they? Isn't today? I stepped inside the tidy apartment, my decision made. I would not cloak my family's betrayal in silence. I would not enter this new life on a foundation of lies. My father is afraid, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. He's trying to avoid being relocated. He wanted this marriage to happen quickly as a potential lifeline. I took a breath, meeting her gaze directly. It was supposed to be Lyra marrying Kaelin, but when he realized your family might also face difficulties, he panicked. They couldn't bear the thought of Lyra suffering, so they sent me instead. The words hung in the air, stark and ugly. Rhea Vance's face was a mask of shock. I pressed on, determined to lay all my cards on the table. Mrs. Vance, that's the truth. If Kaelin doesn't want to go through with this, I will understand completely. I can register to be sent down on my own. I am prepared for that. A deep voice spoke from the doorway to the kitchen. We're not canceling anything. I turned. Kaelin Vance stood there, having heard every word. He was taller than I remembered from my first life, more solidly built. He wasn't classically handsome, but his face was strong, his gaze direct and intelligent. He looked at me not with scorn or pity, but with a steady, unwavering resolve. You came here alone to tell us this? He asked, his voice a low baritone. Something in his tone, the simple, profound acknowledgement of my courage, broke the dam inside me. The tears I had sworn not to shed fell freely, tracing hot paths down my cheeks. My own family treated me as disposable, but this stranger looked at me and saw something worth defending, something honest. Rhea Vance rushed to my side, her earlier caution evaporating. He pulled me into a firm maternal hug. Oh, you poor brave child. Don't you worry. Don't you worry for a single second. If your family won't care for you, we will. She released me and fixed her son with a look that brooked no argument. Kaelin, get the documents. The household registry, the introduction letter from your unit. Now. Within the hour, in a Stark government office, Kaelin Vance and I were married. A clerk stamped a piece of paper with a dull thud. Our names sat side by side on the certificate, Kaylin Vance and Alara Croft. It wasn't a romantic union, but it was a promise. A contract. A new beginning. I walked out of that building a married woman. I had severed the rotten ties of my old life. I had a family now. A strange, new, uncertain family. And I was ready to fight for it. The days following the wedding were a strange, suspended limbo. I lived in the Vance's spare room, a small, neat space that felt alien after the cluttered, memory-soaked confines of my old home. The atmosphere in the apartment was a complex blend of warmth, tension, and unspoken questions. Ria was kind but watchful. Orson Vance, Kaylin's father, was reserved and polite, his military bearing making him seem distant. Kaylin himself was often absent, busy with his duties at the army base. I learned the rhythms of the household. Ria was a meticulous manager, stretching their rations with skill. Orson spent his evenings reading military histories, his brow permanently furrowed as if constantly analyzing a complex battlefield. They were good people, decent people, living cautiously in a time that rewarded neither quality. I tried to make myself useful. I helped with the cooking, the cleaning, the mending. My hands, accustomed to idleness in my first life, at least until the farm, were clumsy at first, but Ria patiently showed me how to knead dough properly, how to darn a sock so the mend was nearly invisible. It was a quiet, domestic apprenticeship in survival. Kaylin and I existed in a state of polite, awkward truce. We were strangers bound by a legal document, navigating the bizarre intimacy of sharing a home. He was quiet, observant. He'd watch me sometimes, a thoughtful expression on his face as if trying to solve a puzzle. One evening, a week after the wedding, we found ourselves alone in the kitchen, washing the dinner dishes. The silence was heavy, filled with the clink of plates and the splash of water. "You're not what I expected," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. I glanced at him, my hands stilling in the soapy water. "What did you expect?" He shrugged, drying a plate with methodical care. "My parents told me the Crofts had 2 daughters. One was a celebrated beauty, fragile, destined for a comfortable life. The other was quieter, stronger. I proposed to the stronger one." I nearly dropped the bowl I was holding. "You've what?" He looked at me, his gaze direct. "When my parents sent the proposal to your house, it was for you, Alara. Specifically for you." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The foundation of my family's narrative, Lyra's sacrifice, my debt, crumbled to dust in an instant. My parents. They told me your family didn't care which daughter as long as it was a Croft. They said it was only right to offer the eldest first. A faint, grim smile touched his lips. A diplomatic lie. My mother was friends with your aunt years ago. She'd heard stories about the younger daughter who fixed the plumbing when the pipe burst, while the older one cried about her ruined shoes. About the girl who organized her classmates to protest when a teacher was unfairly dismissed. They said you had spine. He looked down at the plate in his hands. I wanted a partner with spine. The revelation was a physical blow. They had not only pushed me into a marriage, they had stolen the one that had been intended for me all along. The bitterness was a sharp tang in my mouth. They refused you. They said I was already promised to another. They offered Lyra instead. He nodded. I was disappointed. But duty is duty. I agreed. Then a week ago your father contacts us, says there's been a change, that you are available after all. It seemed convenient. He met my eyes again. Now I understand why. The pieces clicked into place. My parents, realizing the Vance family was also under threat, had quickly switched back to their original plan of sacrificing me. They had offered me the marriage that was always mine, framing it as Lyra's charitable gift. The injustice of it was so vast it was almost laughable. I looked at Kaylin, this man who had seen a quality in me that my own family despised. A strange sense of solidarity began to form, a thin, fragile thread connecting us. "Thank you," I said quietly, "for telling me." He simply nodded, and we finished the dishes in a silence that was now companionable rather than awkward. The reprieve was short-lived. The political climate grew stormier. Newspapers carried increasingly vitriolic headlines. Friends of the Vances stopped visiting. Orson came home from headquarters looking grimmer each day. I knew what was coming. The memory of it was a cold stone in my stomach. I had to warn them. I couldn't reveal the truth of my return, but I could use the same story I'd given my mother. I found them all in the living room one night after dinner. Orson was reading, Ria was knitting, Kalen was cleaning his service pistol. A sight that sent a shiver down my spine. I need to tell you something, I began, my voice unsteady. They all looked up. Before my father was taken, he heard things. Whispers. The investigation into your family. It's not over. It's turning. They're talking about relocation. Orson's face went very still. Go on. They're saying a logging camp. In the Northern Territories. The Zylingal region. Is severe. Bitterly cold. They mean to break people there. Ria's knitting needles stilled. Kalen slowly reassembled his pistol, his movements precise, controlled. How reliable is this? Orson asked, his voice low. My father believed it, I said, which was true. In my first life, he had relished telling me about the Fiancé's well-deserved fate in that frozen hell. He seemed certain. Orson leaned back in his chair, his eyes closed. He was a strategist. He was assessing the threat. If that's the case, there's little we can do to stop it. But perhaps, we can influence the destination. A plan began to form, born of desperation and my knowledge of a future they couldn't see. We need to be prepared, I said, my voice growing stronger. If it happens, they will search everything. They'll take anything of value. But we can't let them take everything. Ria leaned forward. What are you suggesting, child? We hide it, I said. Not in the walls. They'll tear the place apart. We hide it on ourselves. In the things they'll let us keep. Our clothes. Our shoes. And so we began our quiet rebellion. We became a family of conspirators. Ria and I gathered every old coat, every worn-out pair of trousers. We carefully slit open linings and seams. We converted our savings into the most stable currency possible. Ration coupons for grain, cloth, oil, and sugar. We wrapped them in oiled paper and I, with stitches so small and tight they were nearly invisible, sewed them into the hidden guts of our clothing. The jewelry was the hardest part. Ria had a few precious pieces. A gold locket, a pair of pearl earrings, a simple silver bracelet. Orson had a heavy silver pocket watch from his father, its engraving worn smooth with time. We need to melt them down, I said one evening, the words feeling dangerous. Orson stared at the watch in his palm, his thumb stroking the cool metal. Melt it down. Would he want it to sit in some party official's drawer? I asked gently, or would he want it to help his family survive? There was a long, heavy silence. Finally, he nodded, his jaw clenched in resignation. Kalen knew a man, a former jeweler who had been reassigned to a factory job. He was sympathetic and asked no questions. The locket, the earrings, the bracelet, the watch. They were transformed in his crucible into small, lumpy, anonymous ingots and thin, pliable leaves of metal. They looked like nothing of value. We pried the soles off our sturdiest boots, placed the metal inside, and Kalen, with a steady hand and a small hammer, nailed the soles back on. From the outside they were just worn-out shoes, destined for the rubbish heap. We were as ready as we could be. The apartment grew barer, our possessions pared down to the essentials we would be allowed to take. The air was thick with anticipation. The blow fell on a Tuesday morning. 2 officials in crisp mouse suits arrived at the door. They handed Orson a formal notice. He was accused of harboring bourgeois sentiments and failing to adequately reform his worldview. The entire family was to be relocated to a production brigade in the Zylingal region for perspective correction and labor integration. The official's lips curled into a faint, cruel smile as he named the place. It was the frozen hell I had described. But Orson Vance was a strategist. He did not beg or plead. He simply nodded, his face a stoic mask. I understand. However, I must bring to your attention a medical condition. A lung injury from the war. The climate you describe would be terminal. Regulation 7C allows for reassignment in such cases, to avoid the state being responsible for the care of a critically ill individual. It was a bluff. A brilliant, desperate gamble. The officials looked nonplussed. They conferred in low voices. One of them left to make a phone call. He returned an hour later looking irritated. Your request has been considered. Your destination is amended. You will report to the Morning Star fishing commune south of Dalian. You have 48 hours to prepare. When the door closed behind them, we all stood in the silent living room, breathing again. The Morning Star fishing commune. It was poor, it was obscure, but it was not a frozen death sentence. It was on the coast. We had diverted the tide. The next 2 days were a whirlwind of controlled chaos. We packed our meager allowed belongings, including our specially prepared clothing and boots. We said quiet goodbyes to a few brave friends who dared to visit. The journey was a disorienting blur of crowded, stinking trains and bumpy, dusty truck rides. I sat between Kaylin and Rhea, my cloth bag on my lap. I looked at my hands, soon to be rough with work, and then out the window at the changing landscape, from gray city to brown countryside to the vast gray expanse of the sea. We arrived at the commune as the sun was setting, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple over the water. The village was a cluster of simple, low-slung houses made of stone and weathered wood. The air smelled powerfully of salt fish and damp earth. It was a harsh, poor place, but it was alive. We were led to our new home, a dilapidated, abandoned storage shed near the shore. It had a packed earth floor, a hole in the roof, and a single small window. It was worse than anything I'd ever lived in before. But I had done this before. I knew how to make a space livable. As Orson went to find the village head and Kaylin assessed the structure, I turned to Rhea. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with shock at the primitive conditions. "It's all right," I said, my voice surprisingly calm. I picked up a piece of driftwood from the shore. "We can fix the roof with this in packed mud. We'll stuff the gaps in the walls with dried seaweed. It will be warm. It will be dry." I looked at the shed, then at the vast, rolling sea. It was a place of hardship, yes. But it was also a place of possibility. It was a blank page. And for the first time in either of my lives, I was the author. The Morning Star fishing commune did not welcome us with open arms. We were outsiders, city folk, political exiles. A dangerous combination. We were assigned the worst tasks, the most dilapidated hut, and received only the most grudging assistance. The other villagers kept their distance, their faces closed and suspicious. But I had lived through this before. The hostile stares, the whispered slurs, they were familiar ghosts. This time, however, I was not alone. I had the Fiancé, and we had a plan. The first priority was shelter. Our shed was barely habitable. While Rhea stayed behind trying to arrange our few belongings into some semblance of order, Kaylin, Orson and I got to work. Orson, swallowing a lifetime of pride, went to the village head not as a commander, but as a supplicant asking for tools. He returned with a rusty saw, a hammer with a split handle and a few precious nails. Kaylin and I foraged along the shore for driftwood and stones. He was strong and surprisingly deft with his hands, his military training making him efficient and systematic. I showed him how to mix mud and straw to daub the gaps in the walls, a skill I'd learned through brutal necessity in my first life. We worked in silence for the most part, but it was a comfortable, productive silence. Rhea, once she'd overcome her initial shock, proved her own mettle. She couldn't contribute much physically, but she was a master negotiator. She took a precious tin of coffee we'd brought, a luxury unimaginable in the commune, and went to visit the wives of the fishermen. She didn't ask for help, she offered trade. An hour later she returned with a patched fishing net, a cast iron pot and a sack of potatoes. She had also gleaned valuable information about the village's social hierarchy and who held real power. Within a week our shed was transformed. It was still crude, but it was weatherproof and secure. We had a door that closed, a roof that didn't leak and a small, efficient stove fashioned from an old oil drum. It was a home. Next came food. Our rations were meager, barely enough to survive. The men were expected to join the fishing boats. Orson, though in his 50s, insisted on going. His pride wouldn't allow him to be a burden. Kaylin went with him. I watched them leave on the first morning, two proud, straight-backed men stepping into the unstable, smelly fishing boats, their faces set with determination. My heart clenched with an unexpected fear for them. The women's work was on the shore. We were tasked with cleaning the catch, mending nets and foraging for shellfish. The other village women, a tough, leathery-skinned group, initially ignored me, speaking in their own thick local dialect I could barely understand. I didn't try to ingratiate myself. I simply worked. I focused on the task at hand, cleaning fish with a speed and efficiency that came from a lifetime of having to do everything quickly. I didn't complain about the smell, the cold, the cuts on my hands from the scales and shells. One afternoon, an older woman, Granny Lynn, the unofficial matriarch of the shore workers, was struggling to untangle a particularly snarled net. The other women clucked sympathetically but didn't know how to help. I walked over. "Hey, I asked quietly. She looked at me, her eyes sharp and skeptical, but nodded. I had spent countless hours mending nets in my first life. My fingers, though softer now, remembered the rhythms. I found the key knot, worked it loose patiently, and began to systematically unpick the snarl. Within 10 minutes the net was hanging free. Granny Lynn stared at me, then gave a curt, approving nod. "City girl knows nets," she said to no one in particular. It wasn't warmth, but it was acknowledgement. A small crack in the wall of suspicion. After that, the women were slightly less hostile. They began to include me in their conversations, switching to a more standard Mandarin so I could understand. They taught me which mussels were safe to eat, where to find the best clams at low tide, how to dry seaweed for the winter. The work was relentless and hard. My hands grew raw and chapped from the salt water, my muscles ached constantly, and I was always tired. But it was nothing compared to the soul-crushing, back-breaking labor of the rice paddies in my first life. Here there was a rhythm to the work, dictated by the tides and the seasons, not by the relentless, punitive whistle of a foreman. And I was not carrying the dead weight of my parents. Kalen hauled water from the well without being asked. Orson, exhausted from his days on the boat, would still patiently show me how to properly sharpen a knife. Rhea taught me how to clean fish and smoke them over a fire, how to make a little food stretch a long way. One evening, after a long day on the shore, I was wincing as I flexed my raw red hands. Kalen noticed. He didn't say a word. But the next day he walked the 5 miles to the nearest commune store. He returned with a small, precious jar of snow lotion and a tin of protective salve. He gave one to his mother and placed the other in my hands. "For your hands," he said simply. I looked down at the tin, then up at his concerned face. In that moment, something fragile and long frozen inside me began to thaw. This was what it felt like to be cared for. This was what family was supposed to be. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was a profound one. He had seen a need and quietly met it. 3 months after our arrival, I missed my cycle. Then another. The familiar nausea in the mornings confirmed it. I was pregnant. A mix of terror and a strange, fierce joy washed over me. A child. A new life, conceived in this hard, beautiful place. Rhea noticed my condition before I said anything. She took me aside one afternoon. "Alara? Is it?" I nodded, unable to speak. Her face broke into a radiant smile. She pulled me into a tight hug. "Oh, my dear girl. Baby. New life. This is a blessing." She held me at arm's length, her eyes shining. "We must write to your family. They will be so happy." I shook my head, the joy receding slightly. "No. Please. Don't." She looked puzzled but didn't press. She understood more than I had told her. "All right, child. All right. This is our news. Our family's news." She became a whirlwind of activity, a grandmother to be on a mission. She carefully unpicked the lining of an old winter coat and pulled out $50 she had hidden there. She gave 20 to Kalen. "Go to the commune. Buy flour. The finest you can find. Noodles. And brown sugar. As much as you can carry." She used another 10 to buy 2 scrawny laying hens and 100 eggs from a villager. With the last 5, Orson treated the village head to a meal at the state-run canteen. He came back with a promise. When my time came, we could use the village's tractor to get me to the hospital. Their care was a constant, gentle shock. They were spending their carefully hoarded life-saving resources on me. On my baby. The pregnancy progressed. My body changed. The nausea passed, replaced by a fierce hunger and a consuming fatigue. The other village women, now that I was carrying a child, treated me differently. They became protective, offering advice, bringing me small gifts of fruit or dried fish. Granny Lynn even gave me a tiny hand-knitted sweater, so small it fit in my palm. I was becoming part of the community. I was Alara, Kalen's wife, Rhea and Orson's daughter-in-law, the woman who knew how to mend nets and wasn't afraid of hard work. The political exile label began to fade. Kalen was nervous and awed in equal measure. He would often place his hand on my growing belly, his eyes wide when he felt the baby kick. He started talking to the baby, telling it stories about the sea, about the stars, about the brave fishermen of Morning Star Commune. We were building a life. A real life. It was hard and poor, but it was woven together with shared labor, mutual respect, and a dawning, deep affection. Then one afternoon the village head's son came running down the path to our hut. He was holding a letter. "For you. From the city," he shouted, waving it excitedly. The peace of the afternoon shattered. The outside world had found us. The past had caught up. The handwriting on the envelope was my mother's. The past, it seemed, was not done with me yet. The letter felt like a lead weight in my hand, a toxic artifact from a world I had worked so hard to leave behind. The commune, the sea, the simple rhythm of our days, it all seemed to recede, replaced by the old, familiar chill of dread. I broke the seal with trembling fingers. The spidery, frantic handwriting was unmistakably my mother's. It was not a letter of concern. It was a torrent of self-pity and blame. Alara, it began without preamble. Without you here, everything has fallen apart. Your father is impossible. He refuses to do the work, and Lyra is useless. Burden. She pretends to be ill, she faints at the sight of manure. She expects us to wait on her hand and foot. We are starving, Alara. We haven't eaten properly in days. She is a millstone around our necks, dragging us down into the mud. I could almost hear her voice, the whining, accusatory tone that had been the soundtrack of my first life. In that life, their letters had been filled with adoration for Lyra, even in their grief. Now, with their golden child actually beside them, the veneer had cracked, revealing the ugly truth beneath. The letter detailed their misery in pathetic, graphic detail. My father's pride preventing him from shoveling pig manure, my mother's incompetence in the fields, Lyra's calculated helplessness. They were living the life I had endured for 5 years, and they were failing spectacularly at it. Then came the request, veiled in a shroud of guilt and manipulation. Lyra is so unwell, Mother wrote. We are sending her back to the city for treatment. The house is gone, of course. She will have to stay with you. The marriage was always meant for her after all. If you have any conscience, you will take her in. Perhaps you and Kaelin haven't consummated the union? It's not too late to set things right. Let Lyra have the life she was meant to have. You can come here and take care of us instead. I read the words again, a cold, mirthless laugh escaping my lips. They wanted me to divorce my husband, give him to my sister, and travel to a labor camp to become their unpaid servant. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it, the complete disregard for my humanity, was staggering. Kaelin came in from mending nets, his hands smelling of salt and tar. He saw the letter in my hand, saw my expression. Alara, what is it? Wordlessly, I handed him the pages. As he read, his expression darkened from curiosity to confusion, then to outright cold fury. He looked up, his eyes blazing. They want you to do what? They're desperate, I said flatly, the words ash in my mouth. And they still see me as a tool to be used. A resource to be exploited. Without another word, I walked to the small iron stove in the corner of our hut, its embers still glowing from lunch. I held the letter over the heat. For a moment I watched the paper curl and blacken at the edges. Then I dropped it in. The flames leaped up, hungrily consuming my mother's poisonous words, turning them to ash. Alara, Kaelin began, his voice soft with a mixture of anger and concern. Then came Alistair's birthday. Isolde, in her rambling account, mentioned that Lyra had gathered a specific root, one that was free, and made a cloudy, sweet tea. A cold certainty settled in my gut. He died on his birthday, Isolde whispered, her eyes wide with a haunted terror. In agony. They said it was rat poison. In the tea she made him. Lyra had been arrested. She was being held for murder. It wasn't her fault. Isolde insisted, grabbing my arm with a grimy, desperate hand. He drove her to it. He beat her. Alara, you have to help. Your father-in-law has influence now. If he makes a call, says it was an accident. If our family doesn't press charges, they'll let her go. I looked at her, at the woman who had let me be beaten for a bowl of noodles, who had called me a sinner for surviving. And then what? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. She comes here, and you tell me again that this marriage, this home, was always meant for her? That I should step aside? Guilt flashed across her ravaged face. No, of course not. I heard you have children now, but Alara, her voice turned wheedling, you must admit this life was supposed to be Lyra's. If she hadn't given it to you, you'd be the one in trouble now. You owe her. You have to beg your husband and his father to help her. It's the least you can do. It was then that Kaelin, who had come looking for me, stepped out of the guardhouse. His face was like granite. He walked to my side and took my hand, his grip firm and sure. Mrs. Croft, he said, using her maiden name, his voice cold and formal. You are mistaken. My mother flinched at the sound of her old name. What are you talking about? I asked, though a part of me already knew. The marriage was never meant for Lyra, Kalen stated, his eyes locked on my mother's terrified face. He spoke clearly for the guard and for any other listening ears. When I asked my parents to send a proposal to your home, it was for Alara. Specifically for Alara. Your parents refused. They said she was promised to another. They offered Lyra instead. They lied to you and they lied to us. The truth, spoken aloud at the gates of my home, was a cleansing fire. The last vestige of their narrative, of Lyra's sacrifice, of my debt, burned away to nothing, leaving only the ugly, naked truth of their betrayal. My mother had no defense. The shame was written plainly on her crumbling face. She had nothing left to say. She turned without another word and shuffled away, a broken, lonely figure swallowed by the city's crowds. A few days later, the news came in the paper, a small, stark paragraph in the back. Lyra Croft had been found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. Before her execution, she requested to see me. A part of me, the part that remembered the sister I had once idolized, felt a pull of morbid curiosity. Another part, the part that had built a new life from the ashes of the old, wanted nothing to do with her. But a need for closure, for a final, definitive end, won out. I agreed to see her. The visiting room in the detention center was a cold, sterile box, all pale green paint and scuffed linoleum. It smelled of bleach and despair. I sat on a hard wooden chair, my hands folded in my lap, waiting. I felt strangely calm, detached, as if I were preparing to watch a play about someone else's life. They brought her in. Lyra was shackled, dressed in a drab, oversized prison uniform that swallowed her frail frame. The delicate beauty she had so carefully cultivated was gone, eroded by hardship, fear, and hatred. Her hair was lank and greasy, her skin sallow. But her eyes, when they met mine, burned with the same feral rage I'd seen at the compound gate. You, she spat, the word a venomous dart as she shuffled into the chair opposite me, her chains clinking. How did you do it, Alara? How did you change everything? I said nothing, just watched her. Her voice rose, tight with hysteria. In our last life, you and our parents went to the farm and you thrived. You were fine. Why did it all fall apart when I went? And the Fiancés? They were supposed to be sent to a frozen wasteland. Why did they get to stay in some cushy fishing village? What did you do? I looked at my sister, this stranger bound to me by blood and a shared, cursed history, and felt only a profound, exhausted pity. I did nothing, Lyra, I said, my voice even. Nothing changed. The farm was just as hard. The only difference was last time I was there. I was the one who did the work. I was the one who carried them. What did you do for them, Lyra? Can you even tell me? A flicker of something, shame? Regret? Crossed her face, but it was quickly consumed by the all-consuming fury that had clearly become her prison. So what if I didn't? If I hadn't given you this marriage, you'd be rotting in that farm right now. You'd be the one on trial. You owe me everything. You've told that lie so many times you've started to believe it, I said, my voice cold and flat. Kalen is outside. He drove me here. Do you want me to call him in? Do you want to tell him to his face that you gave me this marriage? The color drained from her face. The name, Kalen, was a spell that broke her rage, replacing it with raw, animal panic. No, he can't be here, he can't know. If he knows I switched it, he'll never help me, her hands chained together, twisted in her lap. You have to get me out of here. You have to make him help me. Then her expression twisted into a vicious sneer, a pathetic attempt to regain control. You think you've won? You think you're special? You were nothing. The daughter they never wanted. All I had to do was sigh and say I was a little jealous of Captain Vance, and they gave him to me. They loved me most. They always loved me most. Her voice cracked on the last word. You get me out of here, Alara, or I'll tell Mother you let me die. See if she ever forgives you then. I looked at her, at the desperate, pathetic creature she had become, still trying to manipulate a world that had utterly crushed her, still clinging to the illusion of our parents' love as her ultimate weapon. You forget, Lyra, I said, rising from my chair. The meeting was over. I had seen all I needed to see. I publicly severed ties. Your mother stopped being mine a long time ago. Whether she forgives you or not is no concern of mine. I turned and walked toward the door. Behind me, her screams echoed down the sterile corridor, full of rage and futility, the last desperate sounds of a life built on a foundation of sand and spite. I hate you. Lyra, I hate you. You stole my life. You. The heavy metal door clanged shut, cutting off her voice forever. The sentence was carried out a week later. Lyra was gone. The final news of my family came not through a letter, but through official channels. Kalen, using his reinstated position, made some discreet inquiries. After my father's death, my mother, Isolde, had quickly and desperately remarried a brutish farmhand, a man who drove an ox cart and had a reputation for violence. He was a drunk and his temper was swift and brutal. She had tried to run away, perhaps to find me, to beg for shelter once more. He had caught her on the road. The official report was sparse, clinical. Death by misadventure. But the unofficial word, passed from the local police to Kalen's contacts, was that he had beaten her to death in a drunken rage. Kalen and I traveled to the bleak, remote labor farm to collect her ashes. It was a miserable, soul-crushing place, exactly as I remembered it. The officials handed us a small, plain wooden box. It was shockingly light. We brought her back to the city. We buried her remains in a public cemetery, in a plot next to the one where my father and Lyra had been interred. They had loved Lyra for 2 lifetimes. Perhaps being together in death was what they had all truly wanted. I felt nothing as the earth was shoveled over the urn. No sadness, no anger, no relief. Just a vast, empty silence. We returned to our home, to our children, to the life we were building. The ghosts were finally, definitively laid to rest. There were no more letters, no more unexpected visitors at the gate. The past had finally released its claim on me. Peace, I was discovering, was not a dramatic state of being. It was a quiet accumulation of ordinary moments. It was the weight of Leora asleep on my shoulder, her breath warm against my neck. It was the sound of Ronan shrieking with laughter as his grandfather, Orson, now softer and grayer, pretended to be a sea monster chasing him around the living room rug. It was the smell of Ria's fish stew simmering on the stove, a taste of our time by the sea that we had somehow managed to bring home with us. It was the sight of Kalen, out of his uniform, playing on the floor with our children. This was the man who had seen a quality in me that my own family had despised. We had found our way to each other through a labyrinth of pain and betrayal, and the bond forged in that fire was unbreakable. He was a good father. Patient, present, and endlessly fascinated by the tiny people we had created. My life now was not one of great luxury or power, but it was a life of my own making. I had a small garden on the balcony where I grew herbs and vegetables. I had taught Ria how to make the oyster and seaweed dumplings from the village, and they had become a family favorite. I used the skills I'd learned from a life of hardship, sewing, preserving, making do, not out of desperation but out of choice, to create a warm and comfortable home. I no longer wasted my heart chasing a love that had to be begged for. I finally understood that real love doesn't need to be extracted like a tooth. It is given freely. It is in the cup of tea made for you when you're tired, in the hand that finds yours in the night, in the laughter that fills a room. I had carved out my own harbor, and it was filled with the light and noise and love of the family I had chosen, and who had chosen me. The echoes of that other life, that first life of dust and despair, had finally faded away, leaving only the solid, beautiful reality of the present. I was a Lara Vance. I was a survivor. I was a wife. I was a mother. And I was finally home. The years after our return from Morningstar Commune unfolded not with drama, but with a deep, satisfying sense of accretion. We were building something brick by brick, day by day. The twins, Ronan and Leora, grew from stumbling toddlers into curious, bright-eyed children. Our apartment, once a sterile reminder of a life interrupted, became a true home, filled with the evidence of our existence. Children's drawings pinned to the walls, toys scattered across the floor, the smell of baking bread and Ria's fish stew. Orson, officially reinstated, chose to take an early retirement. The ordeal had aged him not just physically but spiritually. He had no stomach for the political maneuvering of headquarters anymore. Instead, he found a new purpose in his grandchildren. He was the patient storyteller, the gentle giant who could fix any broken toy. He taught Ronan how to whittle little boats from wood, and he told Leora elaborate tales about the stars, naming constellations after the fishermen and sea creatures of Morningstar. Ria embraced her role as grandmother with a joy that seemed to erase the last lines of worry from her face. She was the keeper of traditions, the maker of festivals. She taught me recipes that had been in her family for generations, and together we adapted them to the ingredients we could find in the city markets. Our home became the center of gravity for our small, tightly knit family unit. Kalen thrived back in the structured world of the military. His time in the commune, rather than being a black mark, had oddly burnished his reputation. He was seen as resilient, tested, and loyal. He received a promotion, his responsibilities grew, but he was fiercely protective of his time at home. He was determined that his children would know their father in a way he had never known his own, often absent, father. He and I learned each other slowly, carefully, like two people deciphering a complex map. Ours was not a love born of passionate, youthful romance. It was something quieter, deeper, forged in shared hardship and mutual respect. It was in the way he'd bring me a cup of tea without being asked, the way he'd listen intently when I talked about my day, the way his hand would find the small of my back when we stood together watching the children play. It was a partnership. It was a choice reaffirmed every day. I found my own purpose beyond wife and mother. Using the small stash of money I'd saved from my mother's guilt offering and my own ration coupons, I started a small business. I began by mending clothes for other families in the compound. My stitches, honed from sewing secrets into coat linings, were so fine they were nearly invisible. Word spread. Then I started taking in sewing projects, making clothes for children, altering uniforms. I even began to design a little, creating practical but beautiful jackets inspired by the functional clothing of the fishing village, but with a city sensibility. It was not a grand enterprise, but it was mine. It gave me a sense of independence, of identity separate from my family. The money I earned was not much, but it was something I had created myself with my own skill and effort. I opened a small savings account for Ronan and Leora, depositing a few coins each week. It was a promise for their future, a future I was determined would be secure and full of choices I never had. One afternoon I was at the market buying thread. Leora was holding my hand, chattering about a butterfly she'd seen, while Ronan trailed behind, fascinated by a cart selling wooden puzzles. The sun was warm on my back, the air filled with the lively cacophony of the city. I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned. It was Mrs. Yao, the wife of one of Kalen's senior officers. She was a kind woman but a notorious gossip. Her eyes were wide with news. "Alara dear, I've just heard the most awful thing," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You remember the Crofts? That family who lived in your building before? Well, before? The intellectual family." My blood went cold, but I kept my face neutral. "Vaguely," I said. "Well, it's just tragic," she continued, not noticing my reaction. "The whole family is gone. Wiped out. The father died on some farm. A heart attack, they say. The daughter, the pretty one, she went mad after he died. Killed herself, poor thing. And the mother, oh, it's too dreadful. She remarried some brute who beat her to death. Such a tragic end." She shook her head, savoring the drama. "They say the younger daughter got out, married some soldier. Probably for the best. A family like that, it was cursed." I stood there, listening to the story of my first life being reduced to a piece of salacious gossip. The immense, crushing pain of it all was now just a tragic end, a cursed family. There was no mention of political persecution, of impossible choices, of a love so twisted it became a weapon. There was just a morality tale for the market square. "How awful," I said, my voice perfectly calm. "Thank you for telling me, Mrs. Yao. Come along, children." I took Ronan and Leora's hands and walked away, leaving the gossip behind me. The news should have shaken me, should have brought back a flood of painful memories. But it didn't. It felt like hearing about strangers. The Alara Croft in that story was not me. She was a ghost, a character in a sad play that had finally ended. I looked down at my children, at their bright, curious faces, untouched by the shadows of my past. I thought of Kalen waiting for us at home. I thought of Ria and Orson, of the warmth and safety of our apartment. The past held no power over me anymore. It was a closed book. My life, my real life, was here. It was in the weight of the fabric in my bag, in the feel of my children's hands in mine, in the knowledge that a man I respected and loved was waiting for me. I had carved out my own harbor, and it was sturdier and more beautiful than anything I could have ever imagined. The storms of the past could rage all they wanted. They could not reach me here. I was Alara Vance. I had survived. I had built. I was loved. And that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The end.